The cravat did not belong to him. Nora Cleeve understood this the moment she lifted it from the bundle. She had washed the Duke of Harwick's linens for 2 years, and she knew his laundering as a shepherd knows his flock by the quality of their wool. Knowing his collars, 2 of heavy cream linen and 1 of fine Dutch cotton, his handkerchiefs initialed in blue, his cravats wound from a long bolt of silk that arrived from London in the first autumn and had not been replenished since this cravat was narrower. Its weave was looser. And it had come. She saw at once from a different man's throat. She should have set it aside and sent it back to the valet's pantry. She would have had the stain not caught the light. It was small, on the underside of the fold where a man's chin would press, a dark aureole that had dried to rust. What held her eye was not the blood itself. It was the ink beside the blood, close enough to touch it, a particular deep violet that she had seen before on the tip of a quill she had watched her father bend over for 5 months, copying the same lines again and again onto a bond of tenancy he could not afford to have properly registered. That bond had vanished from their cottage 18 months after his death, replaced by a document in a different hand that said her family had never held any right to the land at all. The ink on that replacement document, she had noted, because she had been a schoolmaster's daughter and she had noted everything her father taught her to note, was a very particular deep violet. She stood over the trough in the gray light of an October morning and held the cravat and felt the cold of the stone floor through her boots. "You ought to leave it on the pile." She had not heard him come in. The Duke of Harwick stood in the doorway of the wash-house with his coat on and his hat in his hand, still carrying the particular stillness he had worn since his return to Derbyshire in the spring. He was looking at what she held. His gray eyes moved from the cravat to her face, without haste. "Your Grace," she said, and set the cravat on the edge of the trough and stepped back. He crossed the stone floor and picked it up. He did not look at her again while he examined it. His hands, she noticed, were very still. "Where did it come from?" he said. "It was not a question." "The valet's bundle, Your Grace." "Someone delivered it with yours by mistake. Whose valet?" She could not say. She did not know which room had been assigned to which guest, and it would not have been proper for her to speculate. She told him so, and he turned the cravat over once more and said, "Come," and walked out. She did not follow him at once. She stood in the wash-house and let the cold air settle her breathing, and then she folded her apron over the side of the trough and followed. The world of Harwick House had rendered its verdict on Nora Cleeve long before the Duke returned to it. She had been the wash-girl since the spring of her 22nd year, when her father's death had collapsed. The small certainty of their life in the gamekeeper's cottage at the estate's south edge and left her mother and her younger sister with a cold hearth and no means. The house had taken her on because Mrs. Dove, the housekeeper, had known her father and felt something like pity for what he had left behind. That pity had a shape and a name. The wash-house. From 6 in the morning until the light failed, every day except Sunday, for 12 shillings the quarter. She had a schoolmaster's learning and a laundress's hands, and the household had decided, without requiring much discussion, which of these 2 facts was the one that counted. The dismissive label had been coined by Lady Pell on the occasion of that lady's first visit to Harwick in September, when she had passed Nora in the servants' corridor and remarked to her husband in a voice pitched precisely to carry, "Is that the wash-girl? She looks as though she imagines herself above her situation." Sir Gerald Pell had laughed. It had been the kind of laugh that required no particular cruelty, only a particular comfort with hierarchy, and the name had spread through the house in the pleasant, mindless way such things spread. Nora had understood her situation well enough. She did not imagine herself above it. She simply remembered what her father had taught her. The world's assessment of a person and the person's actual qualities were 2 entirely separate accounts, and a careful mind kept its own ledger. She had kept hers since the week they buried him. Her father, Thomas Cleeve, had been the gamekeeper's son who had been sent to school on the charity of a rector who noticed something in him, and who had returned to Derbyshire with a schoolmaster's certificate and a letter of introduction, and had opened a small school in the village, and taught the children of farmers and tradespeople for 30 years with a patience that never faltered. He had taught Nora everything he knew because she was the one who had come to his desk at the age of 5 and refused to leave it, and because her mother had said there was no harm in it, and her sister Bess had been more interested in the garden. He had taught her Latin enough to construe a simple text. He had taught her the rudiments of surveying because he was interested in land boundaries and believed everyone ought to be. He had taught her to observe precisely and to record what she observed before forming any opinion of it because, he said, the world had a tendency to supply opinions and a shortage of careful observation, and she might as well be useful. He had died in February, 2 years past, of the same fever that came through the village that winter, and did not trouble itself about who could afford to be ill and who could not. He had been 54 years old, and he had not finished the bond. The bond of tenancy on the South Cottage had been a document he had been attempting to have formally registered for the last 5 months of his life. The estate had changed hands twice in his lifetime, and the older registration was in a form that no longer satisfied the current administrative requirements, and the cost of proper re-registration was more than he could set aside in a single quarter. He had paid the first half, and been promised the completion would follow when he brought the balance, and then he had died before he could bring the balance. And in the confusion of bereavement and reduced circumstance, the original bond had vanished. Nora had found the copy in the primer 6 weeks after his death, pressed between the pages on the Book of Job, which had seemed to her father's sort of irony. She had held it in the cold parlor of the cottage for a long time, and then she had locked it in the chest that held his surveying instruments, and not spoken of it to her mother or to Bess. The replacement document had arrived 2 months later, delivered by a solicitor's clerk Nora had never seen, addressed to Mrs. Tupper. Cleeve is the representative of the household, informing them that the tenancy bond held by the late Thomas Cleeve had been examined by the estate's new agent and found to be irregular, and that a corrected instrument of occupancy was enclosed, which required the family's signature to confirm the revised terms. Her mother, who was still in the gray shock of that winter, had signed. Nora had not been in the room. She had read the replacement document afterwards standing in the kitchen with the clerk already gone, and she had seen the S and the A and the F in their family surname, and she had felt something settle in her chest that was not grief, but was its near relative, the cold recognition of a thing done deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing and believed no one would be positioned to say so. She had kept that knowledge, too. She had not known what to do with it. She had not, until the morning she stood over the trough, with a stranger's cravat in her hands, and the particular violet of the ink caught the gray light known who to bring it to. She kept her ledger now, walking behind the Duke across the kitchen yard in the cold October light, watching him carry that stranger's cravat toward the house, with the easy authority of a man who had never been required to ask permission to go anywhere. He took her to the library. It was the first time she had stood inside it. She had seen it through the doorway during her weekly collection of linens from the upper corridor, a long room lined floor to ceiling with books, 2 deep chairs by the fire, a writing table under the tall window that looked out over the deer park. Now she stood in it, and smelled wood smoke and old leather and tried to keep her face composed. He set the cravat on the writing table and stood beside it. "Tell me what you saw in it," he said. She had told him already, but she told him again more carefully. This time, the ink, the color of it, the proximity to the blood. She told him about her father's bond, and the replacement document, and the specific violet she had seen on both. She told it in order, the way her father had taught her to tell things, with dates where she had them and approximations where she did not, and she did not editorialize, and she did not seek his sympathy. And when she finished, she folded her hands and waited. He had not sat down. He stood with one hand at the back of the chair, and looked at the cravat, and said nothing for long enough that she became very aware of the fire beside her and the quality of the silence. "You read," he said at last. "Yes, Your Grace. Your father taught you." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Cleeve." She sat. He did not. If it would be useful to know that she was shaking very slightly, it would also be useful to know that her hands, folded in her lap, did not show it, The enquiry began that afternoon, quietly, without announcement. The Duke sent no word to his guests, made no alteration to the dinner arrangements, and did not summon his estate secretary, Mr. Braxton, which Nora understood only later, was itself a deliberate choice. He asked her, instead, to describe the replacement document in as much detail as she retained. She described the hand, the seal, the particular loop of the letter S in her family's surname, and the Duke wrote each thing down on a sheet of foolscap in his own hand, without comment. He sent one letter by private messenger before the end of the day. He did not tell her to whom. He also told her to say nothing of the cravat. She agreed. She returned to the wash-house. Over the following week she saw him 4 times in circumstances that were not usual. Once she looked up from the trough and he was passing through the kitchen yard, and he did not look toward her, but he slowed. Once she was carrying the linens up the back stair and he was descending, and he stopped her with a hand at the basket's edge and said in a low voice, "Say nothing yet." And she said, "Yes, Your Grace," and felt his hand lift from the basket and the warmth of where it had been for a strange additional moment before she continued up the stairs. Once she brought the completed linens to Mrs. Hadgen. Dove and the housekeeper told her with the stiff pride of someone delivering a complaint she did not personally endorse that Lady Pell had inquired what the wash-girl imagined she was doing walking through the portrait corridor last Tuesday evening. Nora had not been in the portrait corridor. She said, "So, Mrs." Dove nodded in a way that meant she believed her, and then relayed the complaint to the Duke that same afternoon in the library. And Nora, passing in the corridor outside, heard Lady Pell's phrase come out of Mrs. Quar. Dove's mouth, "The wash-girl, Your Grace," and heard the Duke's reply, which was 2 words, flat and without emphasis. "Enough, Dove." He came to the wash-house on the 7th day. She was at the trough, with the morning light still thin and gray, and she had set her father's primer on the shelf above the water, and opened it to the page where he had pressed between the leaves a folded copy of the original bond, the one in his hand, that she had found tucked inside the binding 2 weeks after his death, and had been keeping ever since because she did not know what to do with it, and could not bring herself to throw it away. She had taken the replacement document from its place in the cottage chest and laid it beside the primer on the shelf, and she was tracing both at once with her finger, not touching the ink, only following the letter shapes, matching the S and the particular open-topped A and the looping F in her father's surname to the corresponding letters in the forgery, which were almost right and not quite right in the way that a copy made quickly under poor light is almost right and not quite right. She did not hear him come in this time either. She understood, when she looked up and found him standing very still in the doorway with his coat dark against the gray morning, that he had been there long enough to have seen what she was doing. His face was arranged in the particular composed reserve that she had come to understand was not coldness, but a kind of discipline, the way a man keeps himself still, because the alternative is something he does not yet know how to permit. She did not move the documents. She waited. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood beside her at the shelf, and looked at both papers for a long time and said nothing. She said finally. He always made the upper loop too narrow. My father's hand was wider, more like a proper copperplate. He reached past her and touched the paper's edge, not the ink. His coat sleeve was very close to her shoulder. "And this one," he said, indicating the forgery. "Whoever wrote it had seen his hand, but only at a distance. The spacing is different. The pressure of the pen is lighter." He was quiet again. Then he said, "There is a solicitor. A man named Croft, who works in Derby. I have seen his signature on 6 different documents relating to properties adjacent to this estate, all of which changed hands in the last 3 years, all of which involved similar bonds of tenancy that were later disputed." He paused. "I have also seen Sir Gerald Pell at every transaction." She understood what he was telling her. "Will you go to the magistrate?" she said, "when I have enough to ensure he cannot recover from it." He turned toward her, and she was looking at the shelf. Not at him, but she felt the turn the way one feels weather shift. "Will you trust me for a little longer?" She had not been asked whether she trusted anyone in a very long time. The question sat in her chest in an unfamiliar way. "Yes," she said, "Your Grace." He did not move at once. He stayed where he was, and she stayed where she was. And the morning light came in gray and cold through the small high window and lay across the papers between them. And for a moment she was very aware of the exact distance between their hands on the shelf's edge, his to the right, and hers to the left, and the papers between them, and of his coat sleeve very close to her shoulder, and of the fact that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold of the room before he was near enough to touch. She was aware, too, of her own heartbeat, which had no business behaving as it was behaving. She had been aware of him in this particular physical way for longer than she had allowed herself to name. It had begun the morning he crossed the kitchen yard and slowed. It had deepened each time he said her name, Miss Cleeve, with that specific care. It had arrived fully formed the evening. He stumped her on the back stair with his hand at the basket's edge, because in that moment she had felt the warmth of his hand through the linen, and something in her had stilled and known a thing she was not ready to know. She was a practical person. She did not romanticize her own circumstances. She had watched the house and its guests closely enough to understand exactly how large the distance was between the Duke of Harwick and the woman who washed his collars, and she had no illusions about what the world would say of any feeling that failed to respect that distance. The body is not always consulting with what the world would say. Then he said, "You are cold," and stepped back and said it the way he said everything, as a fact rather than an inquiry. "Go inside after this." She said she would. He left. She stood at the shelf with her hands pressed flat against the wood on either side of the documents, and breathed carefully until the warmth of his proximity was gone and the wash-house was only cold stone and gray light again. She was not, she decided, going to permit herself to think about it. The permit lasted approximately 4 days. The wound came out on a Thursday evening. He had sent word that she was wanted in the library after dinner, which had required Mrs. Byard Dove to square her chin and say nothing, and the kitchen staff to notice and also say nothing. And Nora had washed her hands twice and put on her best collar, which was a small and entirely useless vanity, and gone up. He was standing at the window when she arrived, looking out over the park in the dark. There was a fire behind him. The room was very warm. He had a glass of port in his hand that he did not appear to be drinking. He turned when she came in and said, "Sit down," and then did not immediately sit himself, which meant she was sitting and looking up at him, and he was aware of it, which she could tell from the particular way he adjusted his position slightly toward the chair opposite, and then did not take it. "I owe you an explanation," he said. She waited. "The matter with Croft and Pell is more complicated than the forged bonds. There were debts. Manufactured debts. In some cases, documents presented to vulnerable families claiming obligations they did not owe, then collected under threat of distraint." He paused. "The boy who died. Thomas. He was my ward. He was 12. The fire crackled. She did not speak. "He was the son of a family named Adkin, from the north edge of the estate. His father died of the fever when Thomas was 9. His mother came to me, and I took the boy as my ward, and I went to London, on business I believed was urgent, and I was there for 4 months. He turned the glass in his hand. When I came home, the Adkin family had received a document claiming an old debt, and in the difficulty of managing it, Thomas had been sent to lodge with a family near the mill pond, and he had gone to look at the ice one morning, and the ice had not held. She waited to see if there was more. There was not. It was Pell, she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. The debt document was one of Croft's. Yes. She understood now why he had not summoned Braxton. She understood the particular restraint of these weeks, the slowness of the investigation, the private messenger rather than the estate secretary. She understood why he had listened to her in the wash-house with the gravity he normally reserved for matters of rank. He reached into his breast pocket and set something on the table between them. A small wooden boat, roughly carved, the kind a boy might make with a penknife on a winter afternoon. It was worn smooth in the way of objects that are often held. "He made it," he said, "the winter before." She looked at the boat and did not look at him. "I am sorry," she said. For Thomas, he said nothing. Then he sat down, in the chair across from her, and the fire was between them and the room was warm, and she thought she had never seen a man look so tired in her life, and she thought also, against her best intention, that he was someone she had come to trust in the particular way one trusts a person who tells you only what they know and withholds nothing they do know, and that this was a more dangerous quality in a man than anything the season had ever taught her to guard against. She said, with her eyes on the toy boat, "I would like to see it finished. What you began." He looked at her then. "So would I," he said. The moment after that was the kind of moment that announces itself by what no one says. The fire burned low, and the room was warm, and he was sitting across from her with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was him paying attention. The way a man who has been taught to command learns to hold himself when he is not commanding but is instead quietly wanting something he has not yet permitted himself to name. She wanted to stay. That was the wrong thought to have, and she had it plainly and without the usual armor of good sense. She was close enough that she could see the way the firelight moved on the plane of his cheekbone, the scar there catching the light differently from the skin beside it. She was close enough to be aware of the exact quality of the air between them, the warmth of it, and the particular held stillness of two people who have come to a threshold and are both pretending, with great effort, to be somewhere else. She thought of it plainly. He was a duke, and she washed his linen, and she was sitting in his library at 10 o'clock in the evening, having been told something no one else in this house had been told, and she did not know what to do with any part of that. She thought of his hand on the chair arm, and of wanting to put hers over it. She thought that she was going to stand up. She rose before she could make a mistake of it. He stood, when she stood, as manners required, and they were briefly at the same level in the warm room and the firelight, and she was aware of the exact distance between them, which was the width of the low table and the small wooden boat. And she was aware, too, of the fact that he had not stepped back, that he was standing as still as he ever stood when he had decided something and had not yet spoken it, and that his eyes were on her face with a directness that made the room feel smaller than it was. She could have stayed another minute. She knew it, and he knew it. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Miss Cleeve," he said, and she heard the particular care with which he said her name, and she left. If you have ever waited for something you could not hurry, you know what the following fortnight was. Stay with it, if you will, because Nora earned what is coming by degrees, not all at once. The private messenger returned with documents from Derby. 2 of them were originals of bond instruments that had been registered in the Court of Common Pleas, and bore Croft's signature. A third was a deposition from a land agent in Matlock, who had handled 3 of the disputed transfers and had kept his own record of the transactions, believing, as careful men sometimes do, that a clean ledger was its own protection. The land agent's record matched the pattern Nora had traced on her father's papers, in every particular that mattered. On the 9th of October, the primer disappeared. Nora arrived at the wash-house in the gray early morning to find the shelf bare. The primer had sat there for 2 weeks, retrieved from the cottage chest, and brought to the house at Edmund's quiet suggestion, because it contained the copy bond and because the wash-house was a room that the estate's guests had no occasion to enter. Someone had entered it. She stood very still for a moment, looking at the empty shelf, and then she went to Mrs. Dove. Mrs. Dove did not send her to the Duke. Mrs. Dove did not send her to the Duke. Dove went herself, which told Nora something about the way the house had shifted in the past fortnight. Edmund came to the wash-house within the hour. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the window latch, which had been forced from outside. The wood freshly splintered at the catch. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Did you make a copy?" She had. She had spent an evening in the cottage 2 weeks prior, making a careful transcription of the bond in her own hand, because her father had taught her that a single document in a dispute is a fragile thing, and a copy held separately is a second line of defense. She had not told him this because she had not been certain it was the right thing to have done. She told him now. He said, "Where is it?" At the cottage behind the third stone of the kitchen hearth. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Your father taught you surveying." "Yes, and document preservation. He taught me to be practical," she said. He said, "Go and bring it today. Come directly to the library." He paused. "Do not use the back stair. Come through the garden door." She understood. She did not ask him how he knew it was Pell who had sent someone. She brought the copy that afternoon. It was sufficient. The transcript in her own hand, matched against the replacement document and against the cravat's ink, was enough for the purpose he intended, because she had copied the original's letter forms exactly, the wide copperplate A and the open-topped S and the looping F in their family's surname. And because she could demonstrate the process of comparison to a magistrate as competently as she had demonstrated it to him. That evening she passed the portrait corridor and saw, at the far end, Sir Gerald standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has done something he is not certain has succeeded. She went straight to the library. Edmund sent for the county magistrate on the 14th of October. He arranged the meeting for the following Saturday, when Sir Gerald and Lady Pell were still in residence, along with 4 other guests whose presence as witnesses Edmund had ensured by the simple expedient of extending his hospitality through the end of the month. Nora did not know this until the morning of the meeting, when Mrs. Dove came to the wash-house and told her, with the expression of a woman delivering a sentence, that the Duke wished her to attend the assembly in the Great Hall at 2 o'clock. She put on the cream gown. Her sister had altered it for her the previous spring, and it had not been worn since, but she put it on, and she put the green spencer over it, and she pinned her hair, and she went. The Great Hall was assembled when she arrived. The magistrate, Sir Horace Tennant, sat at the head of the long table. The 4 houseguests sat to his left. Sir Gerald sat at the table's center with the particular ease of a man who has not yet understood what kind of room he is in. Lady Pell was beside him, and when Nora came through the door, Lady Pell's gaze went to her and held there, and then moved to her husband, and Lady Pell's chin lifted a precise 1/4 inch in the direction of the wash-girl. Sir Gerald looked at Nora and then at the Duke, who was standing at the window, and something adjusted in Sir Gerald's face. Not alarm. Not yet. Only a careful recalibration. The Duke presented the documents. He did it without flourish, in the level manner of a man laying out a hand of cards he has been holding quietly for some time. The original bond in her father's hand, the forgery, Croft's signatures on the Derby instruments, the land agent's deposition, the cravat, which had been preserved between 2 pieces of oilcloth, and which bore the ink that Nora had identified. Sir Gerald said the cravat was not his. He said it with complete composure, and with the appropriate expression of a man confronted by an absurd claim. He said the forgeries were the work of a fraudulent land agent he had engaged in good faith. He said Croft had deceived him as readily as he had deceived anyone. And then he turned to Nora, who had been standing quietly at the side of the room beside the window, and he said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "I understand. It is the wash-girl who claims to have made this comparison. Sir Horace, I would ask you to consider the weight of such a testimony." The room did not precisely shift. It reorganized itself the way rooms do when a person of higher standing invokes his standing, when the air adjusts to accommodate rank and the heads turn by small degrees to assess who is being asked to weigh against whom. Nora looked at the Duke. He was looking at Sir Gerald. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her since she came in. She felt it the way she felt cold floors in winter. A fact, not a surprise, but a fact that was going to be very hard to stand on. Sir Horace was a careful man. He was also a man of his time, which meant he was a man of certain assumptions about whose word carried texture, and whose word was air. He cleared his throat and said that the documentary evidence was compelling, but that questions of provenance and observation would require corroboration from a more. He searched for the word established witness. Nora looked at the fireplace rather than the table. The Duke said nothing. Sir Gerald said. To the silence. Miss Cleeve. Was that the name? The washgirl at the house. And then Edmund crossed the room. He did it in the particular way of a man who has decided something. Not quickly, not with any visible agitation, but with a complete and quiet change of direction that carries its own gravity. He crossed from the window to the table's head, and he stood beside the magistrate's chair, and he looked at Sir Gerald, and he said, Miss Cleeve's testimony is worth more than your name, Pell. The room held itself. Lady Pell's fan stilled. The four houseguests did not move. Sir Horace Tennant looked at the Duke with an expression that was recalibrating the same information in a different order. Sir Gerald said after a moment, Your Grace, with respect, a laundress is a woman, Edmund said, with the same level, unhurried weight, who can read her own father's hand and a forger's approximation of it, who preserved the evidence at personal risk, and who came to me rather than to the man who had already stolen from her, because she had the sense to understand which of us might be trusted. He paused. Sir Horace, the documentary record speaks for itself. I have also sent to London for a Secretary of State's examiner, who will arrive on Wednesday. If you prefer to wait for that corroboration, you are welcome to do so. Sir Gerald will remain in this county in the meantime. Sir Horace looked at the documents again. He was a careful man, as has been said, and careful men, when the weight of the evidence tips past a certain point, tip with it. It took another hour. It was not a dramatic hour. It was the hour of procedural detail, of cross-referencing signatures, of establishing the chain of custody of the cravat from the wash-house to the writing table, of Nora explaining, in the precise and ordered way her father had taught her, exactly what she had seen and exactly how she had come to see it. When it was done, Sir Horace addressed Sir Gerald in the clipped language of legal consequence, and Sir Gerald's composure finally gave way, not into remorse, but into the specific anger of a man who has been convenient for a long time, and has suddenly found himself inconvenient. He was not remorseful. He was furious. Lady Pell said nothing at all. The magistrate's orders were written before the sun moved another hour in the sky. Sir Gerald was formally restrained from leaving the county. Word went to Derby for Croft. Word went to London for the examiner, which the Duke had already dispatched. By the time the winter assizes came, there were 3 men to try in sufficient paper to hang them all. The law, which is not always just, is sometimes thorough. Nora was not present at the assizes. She was in Derbyshire, where the year had turned to December and the first hard frost had come in overnight and made the kitchen yard sound like glass underfoot. She did not fully understand what was happening until the morning Mrs. Dove came to the wash-house and told her, with an expression entirely unlike any expression Nora had previously seen on that woman's face, that the Duke wished to see her in the library at her convenience. She went. He was standing at the window again, which was where he seemed to stand when he had something important to say, and was working out how to say it. The fire was going. The light through the window was the low, flat light of a December morning, and it caught the small wooden boat on the writing table, which she noticed because it was the first time she had seen it outside his pocket. He turned when she came in. "The cottage at the south edge?" he said. "Your family's cottage?" "Yes," she said carefully. "The bond of tenancy your father held has been reinstated. The replacement document has been voided by the court. I had hoped to have this done before the assizes, but there were delays." He paused. "Your mother and sister may return whenever you wish. The quarter's rent is waived." She stood very still. "Your Grace," she said. "That is very." "It is the correct outcome," he said. "That is all it is." He was looking at her in the way he had been looking at her since the morning in the wash-house, the way she had been refusing to examine directly, and she understood that they were not talking about the cottage. "Miss Cleeve," he said, and then stopped. She had heard him say her name many times in the past weeks. He had always said it with a precision that she had taken for formality. She understood now that it was not formality. It was the opposite of formality. It was the way a person says a name they have been saying to themselves in private. "Nora," he said. The fire crackled. She crossed the room. She did not think about it first. because thinking about it first was how she had not done it a dozen times before, and she had run out of patience with not doing things. She stopped in front of him with the writing table behind her, and she looked up at his face, and she said, "You were going to say something." "Yes," he said. He was very still. "Then say it." He was quiet for a moment. That was not uncertainty, but the breath before something irrevocable. Then he said, "I find that I would like to know whether you intend to remain at Harwick." She considered this. "In what capacity?" she said. "In whatever capacity you are willing to consider." "That is not very specific," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest she had seen him come to something she might call warmth, and it rearranged everything in the room. He reached up and tucked back the loose strand of hair at her jaw, the briefest specific touch of his knuckle against her temple. And he said, "I am attempting to be careful." "You can be careful and specific at the same time," she said. "My father taught me that." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he took her hand, the right one, and held it in both of his, which were warm and certain, and he said, "I am asking whether you will marry me. I am asking it, knowing that you are the person who kept the cleaner ledger in this whole affair, who came to me, rather than to a man who had already stolen from you, who stood in that hall before Pell and Tennant and said what you saw without alteration or retreat. I am asking, because those qualities are rarer than rank or fortune, and I have known it since the morning I found you tracing your father's hand in the wash-house, and understood that the most rigorous mind in Harwick House had spent 2 years at a trough." She looked at their joined hands. "That is specific," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned her hand in his so that her fingers were over his fingers, and she said, "Yes, then. I will." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, very lightly, with the gravity and the restraint of a man who is aware that everything from here will be different and who is at peace with it. Outside the window, the frost lay on the deer park in the flat December light. Inside, the fire was warm. The months that followed were the slow, procedural work of a life being remade. The assizes came in February, and the 3 men stood before the bench at Derby, and the weight of paper against them was sufficient, as it sometimes is, for justice. Nora read the verdict in a letter delivered to the South Cottage, where her mother had set up the hearth again and her sister had hung the curtains back at the windows, and she set the letter down on the table beside her father's primer, and was quiet for a moment, with her hand on the cover. The wedding was in April, when the Derbyshire fields went green, and the stone church at the estate's edge was filled with the quiet smell of early flowers. Mrs. Dove stood at the back, with her chin at its most squared angle, and her eyes noticeably bright. The house guests who had been present in the great hall in October were not in attendance, having found other engagements, and the assembled company was smaller and more particular, and entirely more comfortable for it. Edmund said his vows in the same level, careful voice he used for everything that mattered, and Nora said hers in the same ordered way her father had taught her to say anything important, in sequence, without embellishment, meaning every word. By summer, the wash-house had a different occupant, and the library had 2 chairs close to the fire, instead of the customary careful one each by the window arrangement, and the writing table held both their papers when they worked in the evenings, which they did often. Because it turned out that the most rigorous mind in Harwick House had opinions about the estate's land records that were, after proper consideration, entirely correct. On the window-sill of the South Cottage, where her mother sat in the afternoon light, and her sister read aloud from the small collection of books they had retrieved from her father's shelves, there sat a small carved wooden boat, worn smooth from much handling, that the Duke had placed there himself on the morning after the wedding, setting it very carefully on the sill. Without explanation, he did not need to explain. Nora knew. Thomas had been seen too in the end. The accounting had been made. The cottage window faced east, and in the mornings the light came in long and pale, and caught the boat's smooth grain, and turned it the color of warm wood in firelight, and it sat there through the summer and into the autumn. And no one moved it. If you have stayed until the close of this story, then you know what she knew. A careful mind is its own protection, and the world's ledger and the true one are not always the same book, and the distance between them is where, if you are patient and you do not flinch, you find the people who can read both. Thank you for staying until the end.